We have a beautiful old tobacco barn on our property, which is at least 75 years old, and we think it's probably older than that. Starting around mid-March each year, a familiar buzz can be heard near the barn. Walking by the barn pretty much guarantees that you will be closely inspected by multiple male carpenter bees trying to decide if you're a rival male which needs to be run off. While carpenter bees get a bad rap, they are also important pollinators and play a vital role in the ecosystem. Their bad reputation can also sometimes be overblown. Despite having several dozen carpenter bees hovering around our barn each spring, we haven't noticed any visible damage from them in the 14 years that we have lived here. That's not to say they can't cause issues in certain situations, but simply to say that they aren't necessarily going to destroy a place either. So let's talk a little bit about carpenter bees, why they are ecologically important, and how to discourage them from nesting in places where you don't want them. There are hundreds of species of carpenter bees worldwide, but in most of the eastern U.S. there's only one species, the eastern carpenter bee, Xylocopa virginica. This is the species that stakes out our old barn each year. It can be found from Florida over to Texas and the southern Great Plains, and all the way up into southern Canada. Because the eastern carpenter bee is the only species of carpenter bee throughout much of its range, most people drop the eastern part of its name and just refer to it as a carpenter bee. However, this can sometimes get confusing in the deep south, where there is another species of carpenter bee, the southern carpenter bee, Xylocopa micans, or when talking to people from the western U.S., where several other species are found. Carpenter bees can be found in areas where there are lots of flowers for them to feed on and lots of dead, weathered wood for them to nest in. The wood can either be standing dead trees or can be untreated fence posts, siding on buildings, decks and outdoor furniture, basically anything made out of wood. They have no problem living near people. In fact, some studies suggest that carpenter bees may benefit from urbanization and suburban sprawl because of the abundance of potential nesting sites, which can be limiting factors in more rural areas. If you love learning about our native pollinators, like the carpenter bee, then please be sure to pollinate that like button. Eastern carpenter bees look like a large bumblebee. In fact, they are often mistaken for bumblebees, and bumblebees are often mistaken for carpenter bees. The easiest way I know to tell them apart is to look at their abdomen. That would be their rear end for those not fluent in entomologist speak. And remember the saying, bumblebees have a fuzzy fanny, carpenter bees have a shiny hiney. Carpenter bees are also much better flyers than bumblebees, especially the males, which are quite agile in flight. You can even tell male eastern carpenter bees from female eastern carpenter bees because the males have a white patch on their foreheads. Contrary to what is sometimes assumed, carpenter bees don't eat wood. Instead, they eat pollen and nectar, just like most other bees. The adult carpenter bees, both male and female, forage for pollen and nectar from a wide variety of flowers and are important pollinators because of that. While the eastern carpenter bee will visit and use the flowers of a wide variety of native plants, it has a particularly special relationship with one super showy species. The eastern carpenter bee is the primary pollinator of the stunning purple passionflower, Passiflora incarnata. The purple passionflower produces nectar near the center of its flower. Many different insects, including other species of bees, can access and drink that nectar. But those other insects do little to nothing in the way of pollination for the purple passionflower. That's because the shape of the flower is adapted specifically for the size and shape of the carpenter bee, which is super cool. The purple passionflower's reproductive parts are located on a stalk that sticks up out of the center of the flower. Both the anthers, the male parts, and the stigmas, the female parts, are positioned at exactly carpenter bee height above the flower petals. So any carpenter bees that are drinking nectar from the center of the flower can't avoid encountering them. Dipping under a carpenter bee back-sized squeegee-shaped anther results in getting a good brushing of pollen coating their backs, while crawling under a drooping, bulbous, sticky stigma allows any pollen that might be on the carpenter bee's back to be transferred and used to fertilize the flower, allowing it to produce fruit. If you want to learn more about the bees in your yard, I highly recommend the book Bees, an Identification and Native Plant Forage Guide by Heather Holm. This book covers native bees and introduced species in detail, including size, when they are active, life cycle, where they nest, and how they collect pollen, and even has a section covering common native forage plants for each bee. There are sections devoted to many species of native trees, shrubs, and herbaceous plants that bees use. I will put a link to it in the description. This is an affiliate link, which simply means we get a commission if you purchase the book. No extra cost to you. We simply get a small commission from the seller, which helps support the channel. Adult carpenter bees emerge early in the spring, usually sometime around mid-March in Kentucky, earlier farther south, later farther north. The males emerge first and begin patrolling likely spots for females, and are usually the ones that you see hovering in one spot near large wooden structures, like our barn. They are extremely sensitive to movement. Those huge eyes they have are basically super sensitive motion detectors, and they will come up to inspect virtually any object that moves into their territory. This includes something as large as a human, since they can't differentiate size very well at all. It can be kind of intimidating to have a large bee fly up and buzz within a foot of your face, but male carpenter bees are completely harmless. They can't sting you because they don't have a stinger. All they can do is try to chase off intruders and ram them out of the sky if they catch up. Obviously, they can't ram us out of the sky, but they will fly up and bump us sometimes, which can be disconcerting if you don't know what's going on. Simply standing still will usually cause the male carpenter bee to lose interest and return to guarding its territory. The adult females will emerge a few days after the males, and soon after they will mate and then begin the nesting process. Although the males will forage for their own food, the females are left to gather all the pollen and nectar they need to stay alive and to feed their young. Because of this, the females are most often found foraging on flowers and zipping back to their nest. The females can sting, but rarely do so unless grabbed or otherwise severely threatened. By midsummer, most of the adults who emerged in the spring will have died. From the time an egg is laid until the pupa metamorphosizes into a new adult carpenter bee is approximately 2 months. The new adult bees will hang out in the nest for a few weeks, consuming what is left of the pollen stores left by their mother. In the late summer or early fall, they will chew their way out of their nesting tunnels and begin foraging for their own nectar and pollen. In the late fall, they return to the nesting chambers to overwinter. The following spring, they'll emerge, mate, and start the process over again. Female carpenter bees create nesting sites by chewing tunnels into dead wood. They prefer softer woods such as pine or other conifers over harder woods. When they create their tunnels, they chew an almost perfect circle into the side of a piece of wood. This entrance will extend about 1 to 2 body lengths into the wood before turning 90 degrees and continuing either up or down. They don't eat the wood as they go. Instead, they push it out of the entrance. In fact, piles of sawdust can be a good indicator of carpenter bee activity, even if you don't see the hole. Excavating a new tunnel is a slow process. One resource I found says it takes approximately 6 days for a female carpenter bee to excavate 1 inch of tunnel. Because it takes so much time and energy to create a new tunnel, females will often reuse existing tunnels and sometimes even add length to existing tunnels. There are reports of nesting tunnels reaching up to 10 feet in length after many years of use. Sometimes the main tunnel will have branches created off from it. After creating or claiming an already existing nesting tunnel, the female gathers a ball of pollen and nectar, which she'll store at the end of the nesting chamber. The ball must be big enough to sustain her young through its larval, pupal, and newly emerged adult stages. After she has gathered enough pollen and nectar, she'll lay an egg in the chamber and create a particle board wall out of sawdust and saliva. Then she'll begin gathering another ball of pollen and nectar to repeat the whole process, and will keep doing so over and over again until she dies. Eastern carpenter bees are considered solitary bees because each mated female creates and provisions her own nest. They aren't social insects like honeybees or even bumblebees, where there is a single queen bee whose primary job is to lay eggs, while her young take care of all the foraging, brood care, and nest guarding duties. Instead, female eastern carpenter bees are hard-working single mothers who are responsible for taking care of everything. However, that doesn't always mean there's only one female per nest. In fact, eastern carpenter bees are sometimes studied as a potential intermediate between solitary bees and more social bees like honeybees or bumblebees. Sometimes eastern carpenter bees have a simple, straightforward solitary behavior with one female per nesting tunnel who is responsible for doing absolutely everything. In other cases, there may be multiple adult females per nesting tunnel. Those females are divided into primary, secondary, and tertiary categories. When you have a nest with multiple females, there will be only one primary female. She is the one who lays all the eggs and gathers all the pollen and nectar that will be placed with each egg. The secondary and tertiary females are usually nest mates and genetically related to the primary female. Eastern carpenter bees are extremely good at recognizing their nest mates. The secondary females may help with some of the nest guarding, but may also relocate frequently to other nesting sites throughout the season. It is thought that they are likely looking for opportunities to become a primary female and take over a nesting tunnel of their own. The tertiary females don't appear to do much of anything but hang out in the nesting tunnel. Apparently, they can overwinter for a second time and become a primary female the next year. These tertiary females are the only eastern carpenter bees that can survive 2 winters. This nesting behavior, with some sites having a single female and others having multiple females, seems to be widespread and common in eastern carpenter bees. Observations of both types of nesting behavior have been studied as far south as Georgia and as far north as southern Canada. I think it's a fascinating topic that isn't often talked about. It is also a great reminder that things in nature are not always clear-cut. Eastern carpenter bees are important pollinators and play a vital role in the ecosystem and are just a fascinating insect with some interesting behaviors. However, they can sometimes be problematic around homes. That's why "what should I do about carpenter bees" is such a common question. It is also a very valid question because we need to take care of our homes in addition to taking care of the pollinators that we attract to our yard. So let's talk about a couple of ways we can prevent carpenter bee damage, or at least discourage it, and what to do if those options don't work. Tip number 1, paint exposed wood. Carpenter bees prefer to build their nesting tunnels in untreated, unstained, unpainted wood. One very easy method for keeping carpenter bees from drilling holes into your wooden structures is to paint or stain the wood. Painting the wood is often reported to have better results than simply staining the wood, but I've had luck, at least in the short term, with staining the wood too. However, once the paint or stain starts to wear off, it becomes fair game for the carpenter bees again. So you do have to keep up on the maintenance, but you should have several years before having to worry about it again. Tip number 2, provide more attractive places for them to nest. Carpenter bees prefer pine and other soft woods, so providing a scrap piece of untreated, unstained, unpainted pine or cedar lumber can sometimes provide a great alternative nesting site for them. We learned this trick by accident several years ago when replacing our old beat-up deck on our previous house. We had left a piece of untreated pine 2x4 leaning up in an out-of-the-way spot. The carpenter bees that had been interested in the deck were all over that piece of pine and left the deck alone after that. Carpenter bees will also sometimes use a nesting block with pre-made holes in it, like the bee hotels you often see for sale. The pre-drilled blocks often aren't as attractive as just a piece of pine lumber, but they do get some use. Simply providing a piece of scrap lumber or a bee nesting block doesn't always work, especially if you're trying to discourage them from nesting in something large, like a barn or a log home. But it's worth a shot for smaller structures like decks or furniture. So you've tried both of these suggestions and it hasn't made a difference. Now what? Well, now you need to make some decisions. A single hole here or there probably isn't going to be a big deal or cause any major structural problems unless it begins to let in moisture that causes rot or the woodpeckers get after the larvae. If it's in a place where you aren't worried about rot or woodpeckers, then you may choose to just not worry about it. You do your thing, let the carpenter bees do their thing. However, if there are more holes than you are comfortable with, or you're worried about potential secondary issues such as rot or woodpeckers, then it may be time to consider lethal options. Hopefully that's not your first choice, because carpenter bees are an important part of the ecosystem. But we also must protect our homes and property, and sometimes that means making tough decisions. Remember, we're trying to find a balance between our needs and the needs of the pollinators and wildlife we are trying to attract and support. That balance is going to be different for each of us, but it isn't an all or nothing at either extreme. So try the non-lethal methods for discouraging unwanted carpenter bee nesting activities first. If they don't work, talk to your local agricultural extension office about ways to deal with nuisance carpenter bees in your area. While the eastern carpenter bee does sometimes cause issues for us humans, it is a fascinating native pollinator that plays an important role in the ecosystem, especially for the equally awesome Purple Passionflower, which is in turn important to a variety of pollinators, wildlife, and as a host plant for some cool caterpillars. And you can learn all about Purple Passionflower in this video, and be sure to take some time and enjoy nature in your backyard.